Hello and welcome, Michael Volshinovich here with another episode of How I Shot It. And in this video, we are going to be looking at this image here, which is basically a rim lit body shot. So I thought this one was a good one. A couple of you have asked me how I lit this one, and I think there's some interesting details on this particular image here, which is really very light on the retouching. Mostly really just going to be focusing on lighting in this particular episode. So please do follow me. My social media links are shown down below, and certainly chime in on Instagram if there's a particular image that you want me to feature in a future episode. So with this particular image here, let's go and take a look at the lighting first, and then we're going to jump back into Capture One to look at the raw file, which you can see over here, and then we're going to look at the retouching in Photoshop, which, like I said, was very, very light. So here is our image, and we've got our subject this way, so you can see that she is facing away from me. So she's set up this way, and I'm over in this particular area over here. So I'm shooting in this direction. So what we would typically do for a rim light if we were using strobes is we would set up strobes sort of behind the subject. In this case, probably like a large strip box would look really good. And by setting them up kind of behind the subject, the light's going to sort of fan out this way, unless obviously you put a grid, in which case this is going to be too far back. I wouldn't grid this personally, although you could. You just kind of have to adjust the position of these strip boxes if you're going to use a grid. And if you were doing this with strobes, your background would be way back here somewhere because you want to keep it dark. And obviously I wanted to keep a dark background so that the contrast between this sort of rimlet area and the background is as high as possible. So this is not what I did. I did not use strobes for this. I ended up using natural light because the opportunity was there to use them. So what I ended up doing was, if we turn on this layer, I had two windows here, and in between the two windows was a wall. Now, if you don't have that, if you've got a window that spans the entire length, that's okay too. You can certainly work around that, because ultimately what we're going to do is throw a V-flat back here to serve as a background. So you can certainly use that V-flat to cover the window if it goes all the way across and still sort of create the same effect. So the light that day was kind of streaming in at this angle, so it was actually coming from over here. Funnily enough, there was actually a building over here with a lot of glass on the right-hand side, and so what was happening was the light was actually coming from this side very sharply, but it was bouncing off the building, and then that was kind of streaming in through the window on this sort of angle here. So as you can see, this side of the model is more brightly lit than this side because, again, we've got more light hitting her here. And then what I ended up doing was setting up a couple V-flats. So if we turn that on, you can see the V-flat for the background. This is just a black V-flat. And then I put this one a little bit more towards the camera, so I'm shooting from this general area over here. And I put this one a little closer to the camera because I wanted to catch some of the bounce that's coming off of here. And this was maybe positioned just a little bit more kind of opened up like this, so this part would probably close in just a tiny bit so that I can catch a little bit more bounce from this window as well. And so this is just kind of adding a little bit of fill, essentially as much as I can possibly get to sort of brighten up this side. And then I had another one over here to further bounce some of the light that we're getting onto our subject, just to fill in, as much of the front, as much of the sides as I possibly can. And also these serve an additional benefit of not giving me a ton of glare in my camera. So I was shooting from over here using a 110mm lens. Again, that's medium format, so about an 80mm on 35mm. And again, you don't really want to use a terribly wide lens here because you're going to get a lot of flaring, and I wanted to make sure that I have as much contrast as possible. So the longer lens you can use for this, the better, to be honest with you. If I had like a 150, I'd probably use the 150, and if you got like a 70 to 200, that's definitely a good lens choice here. Shoot it at around 150, even 200 looks good for this. You'll kind of reduce the amount of flaring that you're going to get. So like I said, those white V-flats there serve a dual purpose to reduce flare and also bounce a bit of additional light. Now that said, there was still a fair bit of shadowing going on this side of the subject, so I did want to bring up those shadows a tiny bit, so I added a strobe way back here. This is not really to scale. How close you put the strobe really kind of varies depending on how low you can get that strobe. So this one didn't go quite as low in power as I would have liked it, so I ended up pushing it like well back away from the subject. So if I'm over here, you can probably imagine that this was 2 or 3 times the distance that I had from me to the model. It was way back there because I just wanted the faintest amount of light. And I believe I shot this at like an ISO of 12-1600. We'll take a look in a minute. But because obviously the ISO was so high, the sensitivity was up, and therefore even at the lowest possible setting, this was sort of overwhelming the amount of light that was on the subject. And if we light it too much, then we start to lose this rim lit effect, and I didn't really want that. So when you're doing this, when you're filling with strobes, just make sure that it is really, really faint. Another option that you can do is turn the strobe around and bounce it off the wall on the other side if you really want to kind of make it faint. And then another option, if you have like a white sheet that you can throw over top. This here was a large kind of like huge parabolic umbrella, so it was indirect to begin with, and then it had a sock over it. So you can imagine, the umbrella went sort of this way here. I guess this way. The strobe was actually, if we take a look at this, let's just expand this, grab this rectangle here. So this was actually more like this. It was actually pointing inward and then bouncing, and then it had the sock over the front. So we were getting a little bit of double diffusion there, which was reducing the power of that light. And again, you want to use a fairly soft light source here. If you use anything hard, again, it's going to overwhelm the effect that you're trying to get here. So again, make sure that that's very sensitive, and then do what you can to bring that down if you don't have a strobe that goes really, really low in power. So I think that is about all that we need to cover as far as the lighting side. Really, when you're doing this, it's very much about sort of experimenting with the positioning of these V-flats, trying to get as much of that fill light as you can, because I find the more that you have to add with the strobe, the less natural it makes the image look. So try and get as much of the effect as you can first using this, and then if you find that it's still too dark, then at that point start adding the fill, and like I said, lowest power as far away as you can get it, and then gradually increase, because you will notice, and I've had this time and again when I've shot this, is it looks okay in camera, and then I kind of get it back into post and I realize that I had too much power on the strobe. So definitely err on the side of caution and just kind of bring it low, knowing that you can recover some shadow detail later if you need to as well. You don't really want to lose that nice rim lit dramatic effect. So let's go ahead and jump into Capture One and take a look at the raw file now. So this is the original raw file out of camera, and then this is the one with a few adjustments. So looking at the original, you can see that the window is in fact peeking out on both sides here. So the wall behind her was actually a little bit smaller than what I drew in the lighting diagram. And again, if you don't have a wall in between these two windows, that's fine. You can see that the V-flat is serving just fine. Just make sure that you position your model strategically, because obviously you don't have a whole ton of room to work with. And then going too wide on the background will reduce the effect of this rim lighting. So you can't really make that background any wider. So you kind of have to work with the space that you have. And again, you can see here that it was in fact at 1600 ISO, 1/250th, and at 5.6. So I'm kind of straining to get as much light into the camera as I can. And these are the sort of the settings that you can expect to have with sort of backlit window light shot like this. So you're definitely kind of pushing it as far as what the camera is capable of. And hence the reason why I had to do a little bit of extra fill from the strobe. If I could shoot this at ISO 100, I would be pretty comfortable in recovering some of these shadows afterwards. But at 1600, I know that if I push the recovery too much, then I'm going to bring out a lot of noise and things like that. So I wanted to reduce that as much as possible. So in terms of the adjustments, you can see, again, my goal really was to just amp up the contrast a little bit, and you can really see that here. If we look at the levels, if I reset the levels, you can see that original and the adjusted one. So that's where we're getting a lot of the effect of just brightening up these highlights by pulling this end in over here. I brought down the shadows just slightly, and then also increase the clarity just to add additional contrast into there, and some of this flaring here is going to take it down. So I oftentimes do increase the clarity a lot more in these backlit sort of shots than I normally would with a traditional shot. And then, just a little bit of contrast here, slight exposure adjustment, which is, completely trivial at this point. And then just bringing shadow down and then opening up the blacks a little bit. And that is really all that I did for this image in order to adjust it. So you can really see that most of the effect here was just the levels adjustment that I had. So now jumping into Photoshop, like I said, there wasn't a whole lot that had to be done here. I did a little bit of liquify just to bring down the sweater. It was kind of just bulky here, so just push that in a little bit. And obviously I had to do a little content aware fill on the background, as well as just kind of cleaning up some of the stuff that was on the background. It wasn't, a perfect V-flat. If you're lucky enough to have flawless V-flats at the studio, then you're a very lucky person. But I did not have that, so I had to clean it up a little bit and just kind of, scale it out. There's a couple options there. You can either do a content aware fill or just duplicate part of the background and stretch it out, whatever works. When it comes to solid backgrounds, it's very easy to stretch that out. And ultimately, I think I tried to crop it down to a 4:5 as well, so that it works nicely for Instagram. And then if we just toggle all of the adjustments on and off, you can see that there isn't a whole lot. If we just make it black and white and look at some of the dodging and burning here, it's very, very subtle, you know, just kind of taking away some of the shadowing created by the hair on the face, and a little bit on the body, just kind of playing up some of these highlights, so a little bit of contouring to bring that out. That's really all there is. And then if we look at the grading in this particular one, it's again almost entirely inconsequential. If we just kind of turn that on, it doesn't do a whole lot really. All I did was just kind of make the overall tone more pleasing, and I desaturated the skin tones and took some of the redness and sort of magenta out of them. But that's certainly something that you can do inside of Capture One. So actually I saved this without any grading at all. So if we go back to Capture One, this is the image here, just basically with a little bit of dodge and burn and liquefy. So I mean, we can really handle this pretty simply. I've got, you know, even right here I've got a style that I can apply to it. It just makes it less red in the skin. So I can make a selection of the subject and then just apply my skin corrector, which is in my editorial styles pack. And then to finish it off, all I did was basically add one of my black and white styles from my black and white styles pack, and that's pretty much all you really need to do. I mean, as far as black and white, you know, it's all fairly straightforward. I personally don't even really care for the color version of this, so I mean, if you want a color version, I would just kind of desaturate it and make it less magenta in the skin tone. But in terms of black and white, you know, really anything that you do is going to look pretty good here. We can just take this down, further add a little bit of extra contrast, maybe just kind of bring down overall luminosity using the Luma curve. And then if you want to, we can, you know, further add a little bit of extra contrast or something like that. But ultimately, this is not the kind of image where you really have to muck about too much in post. I think it looks best in the black and white because, again, it sort of amplifies sort of the emotion and the contrast that's within it, and that rim lighting really pops when you're in a black and white. So I think total retouch time on this, I spent more time just cleaning up the background than you know, doing things like dodging and burning. Was probably around 15 or 20 minutes. So that's really it there. Like I said, in this particular image, when you're shooting these backlit ones, really take the time to get everything as good as you can in the camera, because afterwards it becomes difficult to, you know, recover details when you're working at a very high ISO. And you know, the better you get those adjustments, the more that rim lighting is going to pop. So really the key there is any sort of fill that you're doing with a strobe, keep it very, very low, just to the point where it's, you know, slightly brighter than if you had no strobe at all. So hopefully you found that helpful, and you try that out. Really, like I said, anywhere where you have a big window, it's a fairly easy thing to set up and shoot. So just a couple of V-flats. Make sure you have at least 3 V-flats for this. Sometimes 4 or 5 is useful, because you can actually also put a few V-flats behind you, and I've done that before as well. So if I'm sort of in this general area, I'll sometimes put additional V-flats on this side if I don't have a strobe to fill it, or if I don't need a strobe to fill it. So anywhere from 3 to 5 V-flats is nice for this particular image. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.